Welcome to the 12th installment of the Good Fight Club, and I have an extra special panel for you today. We have, I'm going to do this, I think in alphabetical order, Edward Luce, who is the US national editor and columnist at the Financial Times, and the author of Zbig, an excellent new biography of Zbig Brzezinski. We have Russ Muirhead, who teaches political theory and politics at Dartmouth College. He serves in the New Hampshire legislature and is the co-author with one of my thesis advisors, Nancy Rosenblum, of the book Ungoverning. And last but not least, we have Lauren Harper Pope, who is the co-founder of Welcome, an organization fighting for a more moderate centrist Democratic Party actually capable of winning elections. Welcome, Ed, Lauren, and Russ.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks, Yascha.
All right, Russ, we have had yet one more round of indignity from the Oval Office. The visit of MBS, the leader of Saudi Arabia, welcomed very warmly to the White House. And Donald Trump even got rather angry about journalists asking questions about Jamal Khashoggi, the Saudi journalist who was murdered a number of years ago.
I shouldn't be surprised anymore. On the other hand, it's absolutely essential to maintain an ability to be shocked, because it's the only thing that allows us to maintain, elemental values. And I was shocked again when Donald Trump, dismisses any concern at all about the brutal murder of the journalist, the Washington Post columnist Khashoggi in 2018 by the Saudi regime. And when asked about it by an ABC reporter, he's indignant. He attacks ABC. He attacks the reporter, and he brushes off the whole event saying, hey, things happen. There are a lot of people who didn't like this guy. Things happen. And it's just the most, it's a complete rejection of any kind of value of a free press, of the freedom of reporters to ask questions. And I understand. We all understand. In the international world, you have to be willing to sit down with unsavory characters. The United States has to do business at some level with Saudi Arabia. We're not too pure for that, but it's possible to do that and also maintain some elemental sense of what makes us who we are. And that's I think what we saw once again fed into the wood chipper.
Ed.
I couldn't agree more. I mean, I'd sort of add to that what Russell's point about what makes us who we are. I mean, what we have become, I think, was reflected in the guest list for the state dinner that Trump hosted for MBS. Elon Musk is now back in favor, but of course Donald Jr. is there. Most of the plutocracy are there, and like any deals that that the Trump administration, does with other patrimonial regimes, this is driven by business. The distinction between public and private has been obliterated. Trump is really l'état, c'est moi, and if you want to do deals with him, you've got to operate in the same way. So we're in the strange sort of phenomenon of regimes that are essentially run by ruling families, finding it far easier to do business with the Trump administration than regimes that are following the rule of law. I mean, Mark Carney cannot offer to buy $2 billion worth of stable coin and push it through the Trump and Witkoff kids' crypto vehicle. But the Qataris can do that, the Saudis can do that, the Pakistanis can do that, the Indians can't. So the regimes that get on well with Trump are ones where l'état, c'est them, and that's not who we were, but for the time being, that's who we are.
Well, this is the thing. I mean, it's the obliteration of what you could call a state. Like a state is kind of an impersonal thing that you serve and has its own interests, independent of any individual. And it's the recreation of a realm, a personal realm. And you think it's all about one person, the president. And if this president is displaced, then we'll go back to kind of a normal politics where we have a state again. but we may never have a state like the one we used to have. And it's quite, I think it's very likely, in fact, that whoever succeeds this president will also inherit this kind of realm and maybe a mentality of realm. There's not even any guarantee that if a Democrat were president, they would bring back a kind of sense of the state.
Lauren.
Yeah, I appreciate Russell's comments about like states and statesmanship. One of my buddies, Daniel Stidd, was heading up an effort called Leading to Govern. He's working actually with lots of local legislators, like Future Caucus and New Deal leaders, to reestablish like what does it mean to govern and to have a sense of statesmanship about your political parties and your government. And I think that when whether it's not specific to this issue, but like just in general, when the left has a tendency to just completely cancel people, and then the right tends to just completely overlook people's genuine shortcomings and actual like offenses and illegitimacies. And I think that when we just completely forsake a balance in all of that, you end up with not only political polarization but statesmanship political polarization, right? Like you just completely let someone go or you embrace them fully. And I think there needs to be a restoration of balance in how we approach these very sad and delicate situations.
I'm with you, Lauren, and I didn't know Dan Stidd was working on that. That sounds really cool. I mean,
oh yeah,
it's also like the idea of a public. That there's this there's a public thing that not just statesmen but even ordinary politicians serve and put themselves into service, the service of, as opposed to a person who issues decrees. And I think when I look at young people today, I'm like, the only politics that they've ever seen is a politics of decree, a politics of the strong man. And that's why I say there's no guarantee that you get all this stuff back, a sense of the public, a sense of what a state is, an idea of what governing means.
How do we make sense of Trump's foreign policy more broadly? It feels like at the beginning there was a bunch of initiatives from Trump. He seemed to have this idea of taking over the Panama Canal and Greenland, and all of that has been slightly forgotten now. He has vacillated a bunch on things like Ukraine, as we're recording this on Thursday morning U.S. time. It looks as though the U.S. may force Ukraine to sign up to a rather unfavorable peace deal, but details are sparse and it's unclear exactly what's going to happen. A lot seems rather reactive. Is there a coherent Trump policy here? Is it all just in the interest of Trump's political standing and his personal wealth? Is it just driven by the desire to overturn the foreign policy consensus in every possible way? What is actually going on here?
I think that's a great question, Yascha, and I've been asking myself a lot with Trump, not just in foreign policy, but also domestic policy. What we see in foreign policy is, on one hand, a policy revolution. America First is a genuine change from the commitment to a kind of liberal international order. It's obviously elevates the idea of zero-sum relations. We're either winning or losing in all of our relations with every other country, as opposed to the liberal idea that the entire world can become more prosperous and more free and more secure simultaneously. And so we're getting something really different there. On the other hand, we're also getting kind of a degradation of the policy state. It's not clear we have a foreign policy at all. What we have is a very, very powerful person, the most powerful person in the world, issuing a set of decrees, entering into a range of ad hoc deals, whether it's Cambodia and Thailand, Rwanda in the Congo, whether it's Armenia and Azerbaijan, India and Pakistan, Israel, and it's not clear that any of these deals, or Ukraine and Russia, that any of the deals hold, that they reflect any set of principles, that there's any institutions that will maintain the enforcement of them. And so we, and by the way, also in foreign policy, Donald Trump's getting very, very high marks for foreign policy. This is where he's succeeding in the eyes of the public in the most definitive way. His approval ratings are very, very high. So there's I think we're going to see a lot more ambition and action. He's aching for a Nobel Prize. The question is whether the United States of America has any kind of genuine policy with respect to the international world, or whether we are, have decrees that reflect the latest needs and moods of the great leader.
Ed, do you see any coherence in Trump's foreign policy? Anything that we can make sense of? I sort of had different theories at different times over the first 9 months. I used to argue, for example, that one way of making sense of it is that he sees the world in terms of spheres of influence, and he sort of wants to let other people do whatever they want in their sphere of influence. But he feels that the United States should take advantage of its own sphere of influence much more so than it has done historically. I certainly think that is part of it, and perhaps that explains why he doesn't really care about what MBS does, as long as he, in Saudi Arabia certainly, and in the region more broadly, as long as he doesn't interfere with American interests. But I'm not sure that these attempts to try and make sense of it in a coherent way really work that well.
Yeah, they call it sane washing, right? And to a certain extent, I agree. There is a sort of very crude Kissinger spheres of interest about Trump. But I think tariffs are really not just his sort of key economic policy. I think tariffs are at the heart of his foreign policy, and tariffs are a tool of leverage to get transactional deals. And those deals, as we've been discussing, that make no distinction between public and private. So the family is being enriched, and I think that is a constant. We have no China policy. There isn't really a coherent China policy, but the most significant foreign policy event of 2025, in my view, was Trump's de facto surrender in this truce that he agreed with Xi Jinping in Busan at the G20 in South Korea, because it was an acknowledgement that, at least for the time being, the United States has a bigger bazooka. China has a bigger bazooka, namely its stranglehold on rare earths, than the United States, namely its ability to cut off access to the American domestic market. And that I think was a watershed moment that doesn't really cast much light on what Trump's foreign policy philosophy is. I don't think he has a foreign policy philosophy. And the one thing, though, I would ask Russell, I agree with everything you've said, Russell, isn't there some degree of continuity there in terms of the break from free trade, in terms of sort of not liking forever wars, the withdrawal from Afghanistan? There is some continuity with Biden.
Yeah, I think there's, you could almost say there's some, look, Trump has in many respects George McGovern's foreign policy. I think he hates being engaged in foreign wars. He doesn't mind, green lighting an attack on Tehran, but he doesn't want to be in, he's very skeptical about the international footprint of the American military. He's much more comfortable deploying the American military in Charlotte, North Carolina, than he is, deploying it in Europe. And so in that respect, I think, there is this way in which whatever he is, I don't know if it's proper to call him on the right or on the left, he's certainly an authoritarian, but wherever he is, there's a kind of, almost, alignment with certain left views of American foreign policy over the last 50 years, and the left criticism of America's sort of what they thought was an imperialistic international footprint. The other thing is his tariff policy has more in common with Bernie Sanders, economic policies than it does with Larry Summers or the traditional policies of the Republican Party. And that's, again, where I think there's a kind of sometimes bewildering aspect to the policy revolution that we're witnessing, which we're witnessing alongside the degradation of a policy state and alongside, elemental institutions of government. One other element is massive increases in defense spending. 13% increase in the Pentagon's budget. And that's, not insignificant, alongside a purging of generals. 24 generals who have been fired or sidelined, often without any explanation at all. Sometimes there's just a story that goes up on right-wing social media, and poof, Hegseth, fires a general. Anyone, for instance, who worked in the office of former General Mark Milley has had their career stalled or has been fired. So I think there's the phrase he used in his first term was "my generals," and it was just a kind of locution then. Now that is being put into practice, and I think you have to factor that into the idea that there isn't necessarily foreign policy, with this great military instrument of foreign policy is being rendered into kind of much more personal an instrument that of personal command.
All of this is happening behind the background of an increasingly open debate about the direction of the MAGA movement and perhaps who might become the successor of Donald J. Trump. There's a little bit of a feeling, some people are saying, of Trump becoming a lame duck. I think that is vastly overstated, but at least of people starting to position themselves and position the movement for what might come once he is no longer in office. Ed, talk us through this rollicking and in parts rather scary debate about what the Republican Party might become after Trump.
Yeah, I mean, there are many strands to it, but the key sort of shift here that we've seen, I think, since the off-year elections in New York and Virginia and elsewhere, is that for a full decade, the Republican line has been whatever Trump says goes, basically. And he has an iron grip over this party. The party is essentially a Trump cult. And if you oppose Trump, Trump will vaporize you like a boat in the Caribbean. And that's changed really quite dramatically. I mean, Marjorie Taylor Greene, Tom Massey, Lauren Boebert, even Laura Ingraham as an interviewer on Fox News, much tougher questions, by the way, than the mainstream media, CBS one, at the same time. We're seeing Republicans take on Trump, not from the old party, not from the Rob Portman, Mitt Romney portion of the party, which I think is defunct, but from the MAGA perspective, saying, well, you're departing from MAGA. And by the way, what we were discussing just now about, MBS, I mean, one of their criticisms is not just you haven't released the Epstein files. Another is you're becoming a globalist. You're hanging out with all these foreigners, and you seem to like their company more than you do your own rally goers and your own base. The fact that in order to try and stop the discharge petition from passing to release the Epstein files, that he brings in Lauren Boebert to the Situation Room as one of the four Republican votes, trying to get her to reverse her position, and fails. I mean, that's as intimidating and as awe-inspiring a setting as you can, as a president can ask a lone legislator to, and that she stuck to her guns. Now, I'm no fan of Lauren Boebert, and I'm no fan of Marjorie Taylor Greene, but the courage they've displayed, the gutsiness they've displayed, has paid off, and I think that's sort of dispelled a certain magical sort of Trump grip. Dark magical Trump grip over the party, and it's very, very hard to restore what he had before. They've shown you can take him on and you can make him climb down. Now, at the same time, there is this other, much, much more foreboding and troubling debate in the Republican Party about whether anti-Semitism is okay. That's essentially what it is. Is neo-Nazism, are the gripers okay? And Tucker Carlson, of course, having Nick Fuentes on and legitimizing a voice that was previously unhygienic. The fact that J.D. Vance, who is, I guess probably the favorite in this battle for the MAGA succession, has not repudiated Nick Fuentes. Heritage, of course, is in turmoil over the very same issue. This is, I think, the culmination of many, many years in which MAGA has said, look, you can hate brown people, you can hate women, you can hate gays, you can hate all these people. Just stop at Jews. Well, there is a certain logic. So, well, why should we stop at Jews? Isn't the great theory, the great replacement theory, that Jews are basically the liberal sort of puppet masters who are creating this multiculturalism we hate? So why should we stop at Jews? And there's a certain logic to that. Why would you stop at Jews? So it's a very troubling direction, precisely because there's a MAGA logic to it. But the sort of Uber theme here is that Trump's stranglehold over this party is broken, and I don't think it can be reestablished in the form that it was before.
Lauren, are we one day going to be in the deeply horrible and paradoxical situation of being nostalgic for the relatively sane and calm Republican Party of Donald Trump? Is that something we have to start being able to imagine?
Oh, I actually think about this often. To Ed's point, and not necessarily about the anti-Semitism piece, but just in general, we kind of lucked out in some ways with a Trump who didn't have that more maniacal strategy of someone who is actually more white nationalist and far right in a lot of ways. And I think that the Democratic Party in particular has shown it's just completely ill-equipped to actually combat something that Edward was kind of referencing. And I think that when it comes to, even with, you mentioned Marjorie Taylor Greene and Lauren Boebert, it's truly fascinating, actually, to be in this political moment where Lauren Boebert is and Marjorie Taylor Greene are defecting from Trump and saying, like, hey, look, we're taking back our power to show that we have a piece of this Republican Party puzzle as well. And I think it's just an interesting dynamic, and I'm very interested to see how it unfolds, because I was reading a piece this morning about Marjorie Taylor Greene's district this morning. And it was basically saying, like, asking like man on the street interviews of like, are you okay with Marjorie Taylor Greene, wanting to release Epstein files and, being this voice to try to actually, return the priorities of the Republican Party to things like cost of living. And they're like, yeah, actually, we are okay with that, right? Because you have to think about, the regular population is, the general population of America is, can be very anti-establishment in itself, right? In itself anyway. That's kind of where, populism kind of comes into play, right? So when you think about the voters in her district, and granted, Trump overperformed Marjorie Taylor Greene by about 4 points this past election cycle. But when you think about her response in this political moment, I think people appreciate her courage. They appreciate her trying to refocus the president on the cost of living and healthcare and things that are actually deeply, important to the voters in her district, which is obviously a largely rural district. And so, again, I think it's interesting to see how it plays out. But I do commend those two Republicans for having the guts to do it. And I want to see what happens next.
I mean, I have a little bit of trouble, I have to say, letting pass, for I agree with much of what you said, the words, commend Lauren Boebert and Marjorie Taylor Greene. I mean, this may be, one of those cases where, people are so nuts that they disagree with somebody who's nuts in a different way, and, two minuses make a temporary plus, but I certainly don't think that they're sort of principled or sensible in any kind of deep way. But it is interesting to see that coalition fracturing, of course, Russ. You deal with Republicans not every day, but many days of a week as a legislator in New Hampshire. I know that you try very hard to be collegial with many of them and have some good working relationships with some of them. I also know that you find some of them to be deeply frustrating. From the perspective of New Hampshire, where do you think the Republican Party might go?
I think what we're seeing in every state and in the country is a kind of movement between the more traditional politics that are interest-based and principle-based, that have roots in institutions where people meet face to face, like unions. It used to be for the Democratic Party, churches for the Republican Party. That you could call kind of traditional politics. And movement between that and a more movement-based politics. So like the MAGA movement is this breeze, it's this wind that nobody can control. There are no local chapters, there are no buildings, there are no chapter presidents or officers, there are no monthly meetings of MAGA. There's no MAGA there. So Marjorie Taylor Greene is intuiting the movement. She's intuiting the movement as it exists in her district. And so is Donald Trump. Donald Trump's had brilliant intuitions for cohering, for what's necessary to cohere this movement and gather its force behind him. He's the sail, and he catches this wind. But it's this movement is a kind of this wind is a kind of force that no one can control. It's hard to know when it's gonna stop, when it's gonna change directions, when its velocity is gonna change. It's hard to use it in any predictable way. A principle-based politics like the conservatism, say, of Ronald Reagan, is a much more sedate and settled and predictable kind of party politics. And interest-based politics, where you say, we're going to serve, even if it's, say on social issues, we're going to serve the interests that you, as traditional Christians, have with respect to family structure, whatever. That's a much more settled and policy-based politics. And so what we're seeing is this sort of very, very difficult, the efforts by these very brilliant, intuitively brilliant people like Marjorie Taylor Greene and Donald Trump to master movement politics, and it's not easy. And Lauren, you mentioned the inability, you referred to like the inability of the Democratic Party. I'm sort of curious to hear a little bit more about that. How do you see the sort of skills or lack of skills, in the Democratic Party?
Oh yeah, I mean, so frustrating, honestly. So one of the major criticisms that even Welcome has sometimes of the left is the left in general, Democratic Party is very much into like anti-Trump rhetoric of saying like we have to fight, we have to blah 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 and protest and whatnot, and it's like it's become so predictable at this point, right? And it's actually a very lazy talking point in a lot of ways, because American voters, like, they want the Democratic Party to focus and prioritize the issues that are closest home to them, right? This past election cycle, Democrats were prioritizing abortion and democracy, and voters wanted them to focus on immigration, inflation, and the economy. And those are things that the Republican Party was focused on. And so, More in Common even released a report about the priorities gap. Voters perceive Democrats to be prioritizing, these issues when they actually want them to prioritize the issues that they actually want them to focus on. And so when it comes to anti-Trump, like, yes, obviously we should have some level of animosity/resistance toward this administration. But when you make it the talking point of every, person in power, and you talk about it in every vein, it's like the American voter knows what Trump is doing and where he stands on a lot of issues, right? He's not the new guy coming down the escalator from 10 years ago, right? And so when you talk about anti-Trumpism, you have to transition as a party to talking about what voters actually want you to be prioritizing. And so, to your point, Russ, like, the party has just become, this predictable entity that's always going to resist Trump on everything, right? Why don't we have more strategy in our opposition to show people that we're not only focused on the median voters' priorities, but we also have our own compelling vision for the future, right? And obviously, I'm in the centrist faction of the party, and a lot of people, criticize centrism for saying, like, you're just the moderates who don't believe in anything. And it's like, no, actually, our friend Yair Zavon talks about, having centrism as like actual vision for the future, and it's not just the non-extremes. It actually has its own value system and case for what governance should look like. And so when you think about Democrats being in power, we need to do a better job of framing what we would be doing if we were in power at this point, right? I think we have truly regained ground on healthcare. And Blue Rose put out some research recently showing that healthcare is regaining trust among voters on the topic of healthcare. But when it comes to everything else, we still don't have the high ground on immigration. We still don't have the high ground on Social Security. We still don't have the high ground on the economy. And so how do we reframe our narrative to show that we're not just always talking about Trump, we're talking about what we would be doing if we were in power at this moment.
Lauren, what would you think about a Democratic Party that spoke the language of fiscal conservatism or balanced budgets for the sake of maintaining Social Security? Is that something you'd recommend to the party?
I mean, just even uttering the words fiscal responsibility would be nice every once in a while. Democrats don't prioritize national debt. Like, Americans, and Marie Gluesenkamp Perez talks about this, like, Americans know what debt's like. They don't like being in debt themselves. They don't like the country being in debt either. The party has just completely forsaken this responsibility to govern and to be able to pass budgets that are trying to be balanced, right? Clinton had a balanced budget like 30 years ago, right? Like, why can't we talk about our aspirations to regain that sense for the country's credit? And I think that, just to your point, we don't even talk about fiscal responsibility. We talk about raising taxes, and we talk about what we can do with all that new tax money, but we don't actually talk about ways to balance the budget, which I think is just a completely missed opportunity.
Yeah, I mean, if you don't like Medicare, if you never liked Medicare, if you don't like Social Security, from the very beginning of Social Security, you wish it never come around. If you hate nutritional support, you'd rather have Americans eating dog food than having them be well nourished. You want to get rid of SNAP. You know, the best way to do all three of those things is to bankrupt the country, and that's what we're seeing. You know, we're seeing the bankruptcy, the fiscal bankruptcy, not just of the government, but of the country, with deficits that are just beyond description, and it seems like it's going to follow the Democratic Party. If anyone defends fiscal responsibility for the sake of maintaining these sorts of things that they're essential, it's going to have to be the Democrats.
There's big differences between the left and the right, and even though I've warned both about right-wing populism and left-wing identitarianism, I don't think that the threats of equal moral stature. But there does seem to be one interesting parallel, which is that the conservative movement and the values of the tripartite coalition which made up the traditional Republican Party are genuinely different from Donald Trump, and they're generally different from Nick Fuentes and others who are growing their influence over the right-wing social media ecosystem. And yet, those generally different ideals have had trouble withstanding that hostile takeover from the further right, trying to explain that these are values of our own that are different, that are distinctive, and that we should stick by. They have successfully been tarnished with the word, rhino, Republican name only, with sellouts in such a way that they've been forced to either surrender or been pushed out of the coalition. It's striking to me that dynamic is somewhat similar on the left. In writing about identity politics and other things, have repeatedly argued that we shouldn't fall for what I call not too farism. There's a way to look at some of those successes and say, they want the right thing, but it's going a little bit too far. And as Lauren points out, I think that actually the kind of values for which I stand are just different in a principled way. They have different goals. They think about the world in different ways. They have a completely different theory about how you make political change and how we have been able to overcome not all, but many of the deepest injustices in our nation's history. And yet, it often seems on the left side as well that the perception of moderate Democrats is just you guys are just less good left-wingers, just ones that don't have a courage of your conviction. And so I think there's a little bit of a danger of a similar kind of hostile takeover. Why is this happening? Is this just the dynamics of social media? I mean, what's going on such that it is impossible, seemingly at the moment, to defend whether it is a philosophically liberal left-wing tradition or a philosophically liberal conservative tradition against those hostile attacks? Ed.
Ed, you get the impossible question.
Yeah, it's a difficult.
I'm glad he called on you.
It's
it's
a
sign of respect that I give the hardest questions.
Your respect will quickly crumble with my answer. Look, I take a slightly different view about left-right Democrats. I mean, I think it depends what you define as left-wing and what you define as right-wing. If you define left-wing as identity politics, then there's got to be, and I think we have seen a sort of more robust pushback against that, and I think it's necessary, overdue. I think the degree to which sort of Berkeley liberalism has been wrecking the Democratic brand across the country, should be well understood, and I think we saw signs in those off-year elections with Spamberger, Mikey Sherrill, and other people's campaigns that let's just change the subject. This sort of moral hectoring, this search for heretics as opposed to converts, is not a politics that serves the Democratic Party at all well, and we should know that by now. I say we. I'm a foreigner. I'm not a Democrat, but I would like to see the Democratic Party rebound and continue to rebound. But I think there is a newish phenomenon, and we were talking before the show, of left-wing young people, and I mean on economics. There is a sort of rebound of Marxism going on, and Mamdani, I don't think he's been written off as a sort of flash in the pan, a pure New York phenomenon. I think that's to understate the degree to which young Americans, people under 30, are on economics a lot more left-wing than we've seen really in the last generation. And they're deeply cynical generation. They're deeply cynical. They're actually quite anti-American. There's a lot of Chomsky as well in their sort of worldview. But there is a lot of, and we were discussing this, Communist Manifesto, in their perspective. And I think Mamdani spoke to that. But I think if you asked Spanberger and Mikey Sherrill, should we have the American definition of socialism, which is socialized healthcare, basically single payer, they would say yes too. It wouldn't just be Mamdani. And I think that is backed up by public opinion polls. So I don't know what we mean by left-right anymore within the Democratic Party or indeed across the political spectrum. But I do think that identity politics is a losing track for the Democrats, and that I'm quite encouraged to see that its peak may have passed.
I mean, what I do think on so-called identitarianism or identity politics, I think it's both as a matter of just integrity, and I think as a political prudence. The Democratic Party has to stand for non-discrimination and has to stand against the humiliation of minorities, whether they're minorities because of their gender identity or their sexual orientation or their race or anything, small religions, whatever. And this is we can't be liberals without standing against discrimination and humiliation. We have to be absolutely uncompromising on that. Now, imposing controversial conceptions of identity on the community via bureaucratic rules, that I think we don't need to be doing, and that's very alienating. But so there is, I think, a kind of there is a core that Democrats have to stand true to. But I'm with you, Lauren, on the fundamentals. Like, this is a party that should be talking about the stuff that everybody wants, which is everybody wants to be able to aspire to own their home. I mean, it's maybe not realistic to literally think every adult is going to succeed at that, but we need to take that aspiration seriously and make it a real, an aspiration that those who, as Clinton said, work hard and play by the rules can realistically hope to attain. Everyone needs to be educated, in whether it's vocational education or whether it's a more kind of intellectual, whatever, liberal arts education, without being bankrupted. And that's, kids are just taking on so much debt. It costs so much to go to a state university. It costs so much to go to a community college. And that's for the Democratic Party. I think Lauren's right on. And healthcare, access to not just basic, but to healthcare. This is fundamental. So housing, education, healthcare, this isn't identitarianism. This is the promise of American life. And I think, what I hear you saying, Lauren, is that's what the Democratic Party has to be about.
I appreciate that. Sorry, Yascha, go ahead.
No, go ahead. Feel free to do the last point of this, and then we'll transition to the next topic.
Okay,
go ahead.
Sorry. No, I was saying I appreciate that. I think, so Welcome recently published a product called Deciding to Win. We actually have a tangible hardback book. I don't have it in my hand right now, but authored by Simon Bazelon. But long story short on Deciding to Win, which is an effort to, it's going off a Nancy Pelosi quote of saying, like, we have to decide to win. And even Welcome Fest this past year, the theme was responsibility, take responsibility to win. But when we talk about the issues, I mentioned this too, but like we need to move the Democratic Party back to the center of the country, not back to the center of the party, right? Because if we're looking to regain the love and support of the median DC voter, like, that's easy, right? But when we want to talk about actually competing in states like Iowa and Ohio, and other states that we used to have a Democratic senator representing us, right? We have to be willing to come to the center on all these issues, right? And I think one thing about, again, moderation and centrism is not just talking about the priorities of the voters, which is obviously very important, but it's being willing to not being so absolute on the extremism that the progressive faction has been championing, right? So we don't need to have open borders. We need to be, come to moderation on immigration, right? And I think one thing that, you mentioned Mamdani earlier. Mamdani moderated his positions and it helped him, have a victory, right? He was talking about defund the police, and then all of a sudden, for his mayoral campaign, he's like, he was walking that back. He was saying, we don't need to defund the police. I apologize for that, right? And the Democratic Party as a whole has failed to apologize and to show that it's evolving, right? And I think, I said this earlier this week on C-SPAN, but we don't need to save this version of the Democratic Party. We need to actually evolve this party. We need to come back to the center of the country on issues and prioritize the things that voters want us to be prioritizing.
I haven't heard other people say that. It's a really astute observation, but I'm done. He moved to the center.
I mean, I wouldn't say he moved to the center on everything, but he moderated his defund the police position, and we give kudos to him for that. Even Trump moderated last cycle, right? Trump was, they were talking about him doing a national abortion ban, and he said no, right? Trump moderated his abortion stance to be able to win last cycle, and we don't talk about the people on the extremes even moderating to show that moderation does actually give you victories.
So talking about the Democratic Party is the perfect segue to the last segment we had thought about, which is the rather strange but interesting drama in the House of Representatives over the last days. Chuy Garcia, a progressive Democrat from Illinois who has served in the House for a long time, decided to retire at the next elections, as is his right. However, this is in a district that is very, very heavily Democratic. So basically anybody who is the Democratic nominee is overwhelmingly likely to win the election. He had, I think, signed as the first person the nominating petition of his chief of staff, as well as many other political insiders in Illinois. The chief of staff filed the petition for nomination, for being a nominee in the Democratic primaries on the last day that he could. And then afterwards, Chuy Garcia announced that he would retire, basically meaning that it would be impossible to have an open primary for that seat. Now, Marie Gluesenkamp Perez, a moderate Democrat, criticized this as a blatant attempt to install Chuy Garcia's chosen successor into that seat, passed a motion in the House of Representatives to criticize that behavior, and was then in turn attacked very heavily from a lot of progressives in the Democratic Party. Lauren, take us inside the story and what it tells us about the factional fights in the Democratic Party, and what it tells us about the Democratic Party's temptation to, perhaps emulate some of the lack of respect for democratic rules and norms that they see coming daily from the Trump administration.
Yeah, this story was truly fascinating this week, and I genuinely commend and congratulate Congresswoman Marie Gluesenkamp Perez's courage this week to do all this, right? We talked about even Marjorie Taylor Greene and Lauren Boebert's courage this week. Americans like seeing independent-mindedness, particularly when you're talking about going against the status quo of your own party, right? So MTG and Lauren Boebert went against the status quo of their party, and this week MGP went against the status quo of her party. And it is incredibly important to show that centrism is going against the status quo when it matters, picking the right fights, right? We talked about, in the segment before, talking about Democrats, always being protest and anti-Trump. We don't always pick the right fights. These are the right fights. Hello, let's wake up and understand where the right fights are. And, this past cycle, Kamala Harris was talking about we need to save democracy. And I'm sure, Representative Garcia was talking about saving democracy, but he's not practicing democracy by, being essentially subverting this election for his successor, right? So if Democrats are going to talk about protecting democracy, they have to practice it. So for our complete hypocrisy as a party to just be like, oh, we're going to overlook, Representative Chuy Garcia's, decision to do this just because, he's one of our he's one of our great Hispanic leaders. Forget all that. Marie Gluesenkamp Perez is one of our Hispanic leaders. She's in the Hispanic caucus, right? So what are we talking about when we say, we have to protect the status quo and we have to protect the establishment and we just overlook this, right? That's nonsense, right? And Americans, probably don't know this is happening, to be quite honest, because nobody's really paying attention to that all the time. But if they got word of this, they'd probably be pretty upset. And I think that it's just a great way to articulate, how do we show a compelling vision for the future for our party? We do things like this, right? We show that we're not going to be for election subversion, whether it's on the right or the left, right? Democrats love talking about authoritarianism on the right. It's their favorite word. They use it all the time, fascism, authoritarianism, but they don't like to talk about authoritarianism and illiberalism on the left. They just completely overlook it. They gloss over it. They act like it's not happening. And we need to start actually talking about these things if we're going to regain trust among voters.
I mean, and it shows, I think, Gluesenkamp Perez to be thinking nationally. She's not just, this isn't helping her in her district. This doesn't matter to, her particular constituents aren't going to follow the intricacies of how the chief of staff filed, seconds before the 5 p.m. deadline. So in a district that's 1,000 miles away, what it shows is that she's thinking about the shape of the party and what the party needs to be in order to win and in order to govern. And I really think this elevates her. I mean, the problem with Democrats in many respects is that, especially Democrats in Congress, they're small-minded, they're cowardly, they're conformist, and they're stupid. And this shows, Gluesenkamp Perez to be none of those things. She's large in her view. She has an enlarged view. She's not just thinking about herself and her seat and how to get reelected. She's thinking about the Democratic Party and in the United States of America. So I'm looking for Gluesenkamp Perez in 28.
Ed.
Yeah, so it's funny. I have written about Chuy Garcia before, but it was years ago when he was contesting Rahm Emanuel. It was actually at the end of Rahm Emanuel's mayorship of Chicago, and he was running for that. And I had a headline, and I'm still smarting from it, which was because his first name is Jesus. I had Jesus cannot save Chicago. And they changed it to Garcia cannot change Chicago, which of course you could watch the traffic just vanish on the web. Like, no, that's not. But the point I was making was that he was a product of a party that has bankrupted Chicago and bankrupted Illinois, that still loses population every year, that is a one-party state, is a machine politics state, and it's where the Democratic brand deservedly is the most besmirched. And the kind of trick that Garcia's just pulled off with and attracted this censorship of waiting till after the filing deadline and then getting his insight, getting his favorite successor in. This is Chicago politics to a T. And anything that can shake up the machine. I would like to see Republicans do well in Chicago because Democrats are more interesting and do better where there is competition. Is that a fair point, Lauren?
Yeah, sorry, I was about to take a note over here, but so I didn't forget. So yes, I think when it comes to, again, like the party overall, like one thing, again, we talked about the 2025 election results, that week when we had the election this November. But like the bigger story that week to me was Jared Golden deciding that he was not running for re-election. And granted, like we respect our friend Jared Golden, we love him, and we're fine with his decision. But like when we think about the fact that centrist conservative Democrats are not feeling like they have a place in this party for whatever reason, we have to go back to like our friend Rui Teixeira at the Liberal Patriot. He wrote recently how obviously the Democratic Party is a big tent, but like the Democratic Party has become a big tent more welcoming to Mamdani than to Jared Golden and Joe Manchin. And again, that is the reason why we're seeing these problems within the party and its ability to appeal to median voters, right? And when it comes to even like you talked about the safe seat people in Chicago and Illinois, and even just safe seat Democrats across the country, like again, the number of competitive districts has completely, just shrank over time, right? We don't have that many districts where you're actually battling purple districts where it's like, R+5 or, D+5, where we're having these opportunities to compete. And because of that, we're ending up with all of these leaders who are voices of the Democratic Party, and they have no responsibility to win over Republican voters, right? And so when you have this rhetoric, like even Russ mentioned this a minute ago, like when you have the perception of the party as only the people who are the polarizers, what do you expect to happen with the perception of the party, right? You know, you have people in safe seats who are able to yap at the side of their necks about whatever they want because they have no responsibility to actually win over moderates and conservatives and Republicans in their own districts. They can say what they want because they don't have the election problems. And even when it comes to, you know, future election cycles, you mentioned 2028, like we are going to have to also talk about, you know, are these safe seat Democrats, whether it's 2026 or 2023, are these safe seat Democrats willing to go to bat for our frontliners like Marie Gluesenkamp Perez, right? They're shunning her out of the Hispanic caucus and they're shunning her out of the House and the Democratic caucus. But are you willing to go to bat to actually keep the independent mindedness within your own party? Right? That's a question that I would genuinely pose to House members on the Democratic side. Are you willing to go to bat for the frontliners, for the nuanced, independent-minded Democrats who are not only able, they're the only reason you even have a chance at a House majority, right? The Jared Goldens, the Janelle Still, or sorry, not Janelle Still, because she hasn't won yet. The Kristen McDonald-Rivets, the Tom Swazis, the Adam Gray in California. These are the people who are able to win in Trump's turf. Like, Welcome only works in Trump districts, right? We're only talking about people who are able to win in places that Trump won. So we have to be able to say and willing to say, like, hey guys, we are safe seat Democrats, but we are going to go to bat for our people who are in these competitive districts because they bring that nuance in our party. They give us the opportunity to even appeal to the median voter in America because they're willing to be independent-minded and nuanced in their politics. So in my rant, but like, it's just so frustrating to see this type of hypocrisy within the caucus of the Democratic side, because I'm like, guys, like, are you joking? You have no chance at a House majority without these people and you're shunning them. What kind of...
It's not a rant. It's wisdom, Lauren. It's wisdom.
I appreciate
you. You want to win in politics, you got to make your coalition bigger, and that's I hear you and I agree.
I'm going to go very briefly into the history of political science here, and I'll explain why that's relevant in a minute.
Tell me when I need to wake up. Tell me when I need to wake up.
Thanks, Russ. Thanks. You can correct me for all the things that I'm wrong. You know, you're part of a history of political science, unlike me. You know, for many decades in the 50s and 60s and so on, political scientists didn't pay a tremendous amount of attention to institutions. They thought that a lot of big outcomes were driven by fundamental social and economic developments like the growth in literacy and economic growth and so on. And so I think virtually all of the generations of political scientists that work today are shaped in many ways in response to that. They're institutionalists because they are saying, hey, these previous generations of political scientists, they didn't pay enough attention to the ways in which institutions structure incentives and so on. We are really going to put institutions at the heart of our way of explaining the world. And I think when it comes to the rise of a more extreme form of politics and of populism, that is often a mistake. You know, people are convinced in the United States and in Italy and in Germany and in the Netherlands that their specific electoral institutions explain the rise of populists. But even though these countries have very different electoral institutions from each other, populists are rising in all of those places. And I don't think that's because of these institutions. But I have been thinking for the last 10 or 15 minutes of this conversation that so much of what we're talking about in the United States, and this generally on both the Republican and the Democratic side, is just because of a damn primary system. I mean, so many of these bad incentives are just because, you know, Golden could probably win a general election, but he's worried about winning a primary. But so many of these politicians sit in safe seats, unlike Golden, where the only concern is the primary. That somebody like Chuy Garcia can try and pass down that seat because he knows that once there's that D next to somebody's name in the general election, they're definitely going to win. So much of this seems to come downstream from the primary system. Russ.
By the way, brilliant history of political science. I love it. And I think the primary system is interacting with a culture of moral self-indulgence and in order to produce kind of extremists. So primary voters, I mean, I think we teach young people that you know, your job is to be on the side of moral truth and then to fight for it in an uncompromising way, as opposed to thinking, you know, it's really hard to have the whole truth, to possess the whole truth. And different people in a community have different, you know, get different kind of angles on the truth. And you have to listen and you have to compromise and you have to learn how to, you know, we have a generation of people who don't grow up in families so large that they need to share a bedroom. So they never compromise with their sibling. You know, they have rooms to themselves and they learn how to just, you know, to totally value their own convictions and never compromise. And then they go vote in a primary election And they think their job is to win the whole truth for the social world, when actually their job is to form a kind of morally untidy, large, and lasting coalition that can govern in a just and reasonable way. And so it's not just primaries; it's primary voters, and I don't want to let those voters off the hook. I mean, I think, in some constitutions, you mentioned institutions, like some constitutions, say the UK so-called constitution, 35% in the popular vote can get you 65% in parliament. That's what happened to the Labour Party. It's amazing. The US Constitution forces us to build really large and really durable coalitions. And I think, everybody, leaders and voters, need to understand that that is what the US Constitution asks of us. It's possible to do it, but I don't think we've been trying to do it for a long time.
We found, Welcome did a survey recently, I think, or maybe a couple years ago, but we found that only 1 in 5 Democratic primary voters are actually the uber progressives. Right. And so when we even talk about safe seat Democrats, we have to talk about the fact that we don't even flesh out the fact that if 1 in 5 primary voters are progressive, what about the other voters in that primary who are not progressive? Right. We have the Democratic Party has been completely hemorrhaging Black and Hispanic and Asian voters. And when we don't talk about the fact that Black and Hispanic Asian voters are largely moderate to conservative voters, you're just continuing to pander to the white college-educated liberals that are in this district that are only making up a fifth of this primary anyway.
Very brief final question for everybody. Is there hope for the Democratic Party? Are we going to get the ducks in a row? Are we going to get the act together for the midterms in 2026 and the presidential election in 2028? Ed, why don't we start with you?
Look, I never. You should never underestimate the Democratic capacity to screw up. And so I'm not going to. But I will not underestimate either Trump's capacity to keep delivering, compelling arguments to vote for the other party, namely the Democrats. Because I think we have passed, as we were discussing earlier, we've passed a point with Trump where he's lost his grip and where, the ability for him to actually restore any economic confidence to the median American voter is slipping. The appetite was never there, and the bullshit just shines through. He keeps telling voters that it's fake news, that they feel life's unaffordable, and it isn't fake news. And as long as he does that, Democrats will win.
Russ.
I think Democrats will win in 26, but I think that the issue is when given the structural fact that we don't have the presidency, we don't have a national leader. And so there is no party. They're just a bunch of people who call themselves Democrats, and no one's going to be able to speak for the party, and no one's going to try until we have a presidential campaign. I think the nominee in 28 is going to be Newsom, if I had to bet right now. And so I think the question is, and I think the downside is that he's a politician. The best thing you can say about him is that he is a politician. And so being a politician, I think there's less chance that he's going to screw up in the way that's so traditional for Democrats. But I do worry about this, which is that the higher the probability the Democrats are going to win in the presidential election of 2028, the lower the probability that we're going to have a free and fair election in 2028.
I'll make mine quick. I've been saying I think that Democrats are probably going to win on purpose in 2026 or by accident, and I think that we are trending by accident. Our friend Laksha Jain at The Argument and Split Ticket was putting out how he does think Republicans are probably going to perform poorly next cycle for the midterms, which is likely. But again, we're not going to be winning probably 2026 because we're doing it because we're actually evolving to the median voter in America. We're just going to be able to do it because of Republicans' failures, right? And I think that we should stop trying to bank on Republicans' failures and actually have some convictions of our own that allow us to regain trust among voters. And when it comes to the 2028 conversation, I was telling a friend last night, I'm still waiting for someone to wow me, right? And I would love to be wowed. I would love to see someone who is actually at the median voter in America instead of us battling over, is it going to be progressive or a centrist as the nominee? Obviously, if it's a progressive, we're probably going to lose. And I think that we should take this conversation seriously. But we also have to have someone with the centrist credentials and the centrist and depolarizing courage to actually say what voters believe instead of just trying to appease party people.
Edward, Lauren, Russ, thank you so much for coming on the Good Fight Club.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, thank you.